Om. 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 Om Tat Sat. Om Satyanandam. Om Paravak Shakti. Om. God alone exists. God alone is reality. The 22nd live stream teaching. The 22nd live stream teaching of SATYAVEDISM. Om, Mouna or Mauna, the practice of silence and God silence. Lssv 22. Om. Om, Mouna. Silence. Mouna, the practice of silence, overlaps to some extent the practice of meditation and the practice of witnessing thought. And as such, it is a core teaching, integral methods of God realization of SATYAVEDISM. It cannot be emphasized enough how important the practice of this teaching is, in conjunction with the practice of Lssv 12 and Lssv 21. Lssv 12 is Om, effortless non-believing without resistance. And Lssv 21 is Om, deprogramming from species centrism. So in tandem or in conjunction with those teachings and subsequent teachings specifically on meditation and specifically on witnessing, this is so important, this teaching of Mouna, that it is only an introduction to Mouna. There are to be subsequent integral methods, scriptures as well about Mouna, delineating specifics concisely. It is essential that this teaching be absorbed and implemented. So the practice of Mouna, the silence, it seemingly begins to uncover the truth silence that is inherent and innate in God Absolute. So this practice is an uncovering of the real silence. when there is God realization, self-realization and God realization, either seemingly gradually or sudden, there can be a shock. Seemingly the pseudo-ego reeling back and disintegrating, and speech. There can be the leaving of speechlessness, because there is the feeling that there is nothing to speak about. So the practice of Mouna, the practice of silence, is a seeming preparation for the overstanding of that possible occurrence. Now, there is a difference between verbal and mental and God silence. Verbal silence is to seemingly stop speaking words, language. So it is a form of fasting from language. And as such, it is also a way to detox. It calls attention to language as well and how it is used, seemingly outwardly and seemingly inwardly, although there is no distinction in truth. And then there is mental fasting, which means that the language is not being heard internally, seemingly. And this can also refer to seeming internal eye images. And this is all pointing to God's silence, which is always already there. Language should be used in service to God truth. In relativity, it is often used what could be characterized as mindlessly, sort of in an automated way. And much of the language is copy and pasted cliches strung together, occurring in consciousness. So the practice of silence calls attention to the use of language. So there's witnessing, or what would be called introspection, and there is also extrospection, meaning outer, inner and outer. Again, there is no distinction. This is what it feels like. And that will be gone into in another teaching. And there can be the use of Om to focus the attention away from extraneous wordplay. Again, that is another teaching, Om, the teaching of Om. Now, there is no obligation to speak. There is much of the hypnotism that conveys that it is necessary to speak a lot, or to speak volumes. But much of it is really unnecessary. So this practice calls attention to that. So there is no obligation to speak. It will be elucidated what circumstances under which there could seemingly be need for speaking. But there are no seeming bodies that are compelling or making other seeming bodies speak. It is more to do with habit. So if there's practicing of silence, this must be remembered upon initial implementation, that there is no seemingly owing anybody anything about having to speak. And there should not be, or there should not have to be, argumentation about seemingly claiming the right to not speak, if that can be felt. Just as there is freedom of speech, there is inherently freedom of silence. So most body nervous systems are rather overloaded. So it's best to introduce the practice of Mouna in seeming stages as can be tolerated by the body, and also by the thoughts mentally as the pseudo-egoing may be trying to counteract it, the implementation. So if there's attempt at sudden total silence, then there might be symptoms, including lack of patience, or nervousness, or anxiety, or boredom, or even fear or depression, etc. Because there is this unaccustomedness to the actual experience of silence. So it might be felt that way, and if so, there should be pulling back and implementing more slowly, incrementally, as tolerated. There can also be great relief from the overloaded system of the body. Relief that might not have ever been felt before. So the practice of Mouna is another step to begin to reduce fictional thought and facilitate God consciousness command of language and linguistics. It calls attention to words when used, and it fosters linguistic discipline. And it can be best used in conjunction with Godlang, but it need not be. So, Om, step 1 of the practice of Mouna, or Mon. There's the observance of seeming incoming speech. There is listening. Listening occurs in God consciousness. And this listening becomes magnified when there is not the noise of the coming response or the reactive response, linguistically and emotionally and all. So there's actual listening. And that allows greater understanding and less seeming miscommunication. And then the words that would go outward or be externalized are stopped seemingly at the gateway. So initially the words may be thought, but the words are not released to be completely activated. So this is the practice of not speaking. So this can lead to the slowing of the trafficking of thought. And there is witnessing occurring. The mind seemingly is actually witnessing and reacting to the mind processing. And then there is the true witnessing, that is God consciousness and God absolute seemingly behind that, but within all. So of course the witness as the mind eventually must be dropped. But there is witnessing within the practice of Mouna. And there is not forcing the mind and the thoughts to stop. So this is practicing not speaking. And then this should lead to the diminishing of thought, which is another form of the practice of Mouna. When the mind trafficking and processing starts to calm. And then that affects the body seeming physiology in the relief felt. So there, in this step, there can still be reading occurring, or activities such as watching, visuals, other activities such as listening, So this would be still processing thought or words, but not externalizing, seemingly. So this is a verbal discipline, but it leads to nonverbal discipline. And it is the calling attention to internal seeming voicing, and then becoming less reactive. Specifics are to follow. So, when apparent bodies gather, seemingly, when the gathering occurs, the practice of Mouna or silence takes on seeming complications, because it is seemingly much easier to practice Mouna when the body seems to be alone, apparently. But when there are other seeming bodies present, it takes on a more complex aspect. So, there should not be feelings of pressure or encouragement to break silence when the silence is in effect. There may be seeming others, God in the form of, that want to encourage the breaking of the silence, because it is seen as some sort of joke or not important. So there are ways to convey the importance of the practice, or else to display that the practice is in effect, without having to resort to breaking the silence in order to explain it. There should be as little gesturing as possible, with the exception of perhaps nodding affirmative or yes or no, and other small gestures of the body, but not resorting to pantomime and playing of charades or sign language. And there should be writing or typing text only if it's urgently necessary. And there should be speech only if it's urgently necessary. So there should be basically witnessing of seeming gathering and not speaking. So one of the ways that it can be conveyed is there can be the making of what is called a lanyard around the neck of the body with an vinyl horizontal holder, clear, with a message inside of it. Sort of like what is called a name tag in fiction around the neck. And it would simply state silence, or etc. This is a variant of that. You can also create a card. So this card has, this is God Lang here. It says Git Ho, means God in the happening of. Silence. And then to convey that there is still attention while the silence is going on, and that there can be continuing of seeming other God in the form of bodies speaking, so as not to appear what would be considered antisocial or something in fiction. So that there's encouragement that there should be continued speaking, there's listening, and it actually is deep listening, because there is no waiting to start speaking. There is just listening. And the heart, Om. And listening in love, Om. In God Absolute. And then close, Om. Close in God Lang. So this is an example. But the lanyard way is more succinct and noticeable, and it can be taken on and off. And when the Math Ashrama Pitham are established, such tags will exist, and the body seemingly going in and out will have this tag when silence is in effect, to make it very easy visually to see those seeming bodies partaking in it and those not. But again, this is when there is, in the midst of God happenings, and not seemingly in isolation as seeming when the body sits in meditation and there are seemingly no other bodies around, etc. Then the practice of Mouna is easier in that way. So as for implementation, the easiest times seemingly in eternity would be what is called Gettern morning or evening Om, because there are many more seeming activities and functionings that are occurring in the interim. So there should be witnessing of external and internal thoughts and emotions, and letting those phenomena just happen. In advanced stages, thought can be stopped, like on and off. But in the initial stages, the thought is just allowed to happen. So there is practice of no speech, and then this is leading to reduction of thought and images when it's continuously practiced and it becomes habitual. So it can be started with, well, perhaps 15 minutes in eternity, and then incrementally raised to half an hour in eternity, and then maybe an hour, just to get the feeling of it and be able to suss the toleration levels of the pseudo-egoing and the feelings in the body. And then it can be expanded to perhaps a day in eternity, or even a whole weekend in eternity. If there is resources that can be set aside for the body, ideally to be in a form of isolation, and when the body is not employed in such activities, usually in what is called a week in infinity or in eternity in fiction, because all of this time speak is not real. But that is how the, in relativity, how these events are navigated. So while there is not engagement in educational processes, mandatory educational processes, or mandatory employment processes, then if it can be extended to what is called a weekend in eternity, then there would really be the beginning of a sense of immersion in silence. And then the benefits would start to show. They would start to be revealed. And then etc. So incrementally. Then there are also ways to have the practice occur more than once, seemingly in a day in eternity. It could be twice, and then increase to 3 times, and then increasingly increased to in between activities where there seems to be necessity for speaking. So there will start to be enjoying and relief and just being. Step 2, this goes from the non-speaking in seeming auditory fashion to non-speaking in other modes. So there would be the reduction and elimination of such forms of communication, again, within the seeming window of practice. So no emails, got in the form of no emails, no texting, no social media, no phone calls, and no writing. So during the seeming sessions of the practice of silence, those forms of communication would cease as well. This is step 2. So then there is no longer seemingly the having to engage incoming language, having to respond, or to bring forth such language in other forms. And again, then having to engage the reaction in response to that. Now, some practices that can continue during step 2 would be that there would still be the absorption of text through reading, other forms of reading, and watching and listening. So it basically would be the elimination of what would be called direct communication modes: emails, texting, social media, phone calls, writing. It also might be helpful if there are seeming God in the form of multi-species, seemingly, such as the animals that are in vicinity in infinity, to observe the basic non-speaking of how seeming multi-species bodies behave, the behavior. There are sounds that emanate periodically from such seeming bodies, but for the most part, many of the seeming bodies are silent. So there can be great learning from observing that silence, coming aura of silence. And there may begin to be a resonance with that seeming silence. Step 3, Om. So again, in conjunction with Lssv 21, Om, deprogramming from species centrism, and to reduce the belief in the fiction, Om, the practice of non-believing, Lssv 12, Om, effortless non-believing without resistance, Om. So these are those teachings are in conjunction with this teaching to be combined. And this is to further reduce and eliminate primary sources of species fiction. So the further reduction would be during the phases of implementation of Mouna, the practice, that there would be no reading and no watching and no seeming listening to fiction. So this is a further reduction. And this causes seeming more silence in God consciousness. Again, so unless it is mandatory or unavoidable or assigned by education or working systemings, then there should be the affirmation, since there is reducing and eliminating, the beginning of the affirmation of truth content, such as the scriptures or the live stream teachings, the satsangs teachings, teachings that speak of God truth. Or information that, God information that is truth. Again, these teachings are to be gone into extensively to be able to discern fiction from truth. So this should not get too extreme, however, the practice of Mouna, where there's use of silence in order to as avoidance of seemingly important activity or escapism in the dreaming. And there should not have to be arguing or negotiating silence. It is to feel natural. Step 4. What would be considered natural, Mouna? Natural silence. So this seemingly becomes habitual. And it is integrated into all seeming God activities, and less seemingly compartmentalized in fiction. So through the other steps, it becomes sort of gradually and naturally practiced. Without seeming stops and starts and segmenting of the practice. And this reconfigures the neural networking and the thought processing, the very way in which the thoughts are processed. So in this phase, there is thinking occurring when it naturally seems to be needed. And there is speaking that comes forth when it is naturally needed. And speech can appear to become very concise and even mathematical. Or speech can pour forth whatever is needed. But there is the elimination of unnecessary speech. So it is a seeming form of verbal minimalism. Speech becomes very directed. Becomes very effective, and it activates in God consciousness with great utility. Mouna points back to the source of speech, the paravak. So the practice of Mouna, on the surface, it simply looks like reducing speech or stopping speech for a seeming period of time in eternity. But it is much more than that. It is only the beginning of going into the deeper realization of God, absolute silence, and the source of all seeming communication, all seeming word. In eternity came forth words, symbols, from sounds, sounding, from primordial Om resonance, creating mathematical structurings. It's all sounds coming forth. Creating the coding of structurings, resonating in God consciousness. So the Om, the practice of Mouna, periods of non-speaking, of listening carefully, God listening to God about God. Reducing of fictioning. The slowing of fictional thoughts, thought processings. The disappearancing of pseudo-egoing processings. The direct knowledge of true silence. True Mouna, God Mouna. That is true God silence. Self-realization and God realization. That always already is. Om, Paravak Shakti. Om, Satyanandam. Om, Tat Sat.